What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys a set of Heisman sliders for Dynasty mode within CFB 26. We're going to go ahead and get the sliders out of the way early. So if that's all you came here for, that's perfectly fine. I'll get you guys a quick view of them. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth later in the video on what everything means, because there are some additions of other sliders. And after I give you the general set of player and CPU sliders, we're then going to also discuss a little bit about fatigue and different franchise settings. So if you want to know about what our sliders are interacting with as far as those types of things are concerned, stick around for that as well. However, we have been hard at work testing this across multiple dynasties, and we've come up with a really solid set of sliders that are going to give you some pretty realistic, pretty competitive gameplay within CFB 26. And without further ado, the sliders are 55 QB accuracy, 65 pass blocking, 48, 57, 55, 45, 35, 48, 55. As I mentioned, we'll go more in depth as to why everything is where it is in a little bit here. CPU skill 40, 45, 48, 47, 55, 45, 25, 40, and 55. So this would be your opportunity to take a screenshot of the CPU skill. And then we have the special teams at 50, 47, 55, 45, and 55. And then not a whole lot changed as far as game options are concerned, but we do have injuries turned down to 35, fatigue all the way up to 70, base 50s for all of the precipitation sliders. And then moving on to penalties, everything is set to the base of 50. We will probably toy with these a little bit more as things go on, but we haven't had enough testing to this point to really warrant increasing or decreasing these one way or the other. But the gameplay has been fantastic. Almost every single game in all of our leagues has been super competitive, so I just wanted to kind of show you a little bit of that real quick. We're seeing a lot of overtime games, a lot of really close games for, similar skill set teams, like this 36-34 win over Utah, 20-17 Cal versus San Diego State, so on and so forth. A lot of really close, really competitive games. It's been really fun. A little bit low scoring, I will say, so that might play a little bit more into some of the dynasty settings, which we're going to get into now. One thing that's worthwhile to mention is going to be your auto subs, which we have not modified much because they've actually done really nice as far as putting our players where they need to be as far as subbing in and sub out numbers as base numbers, as we mentioned last year whenever we discussed this stuff. So not really any changes here. There are some new settings to these different auto sub stuff, and we'll be making separate videos on some of those things. But now we'll get into some of the franchise settings, just the general setup that interacts with all of this. And as I mentioned, we're on 70 fatigue right now, but we also want to talk about wear and tear and whatnot, and then we'll go back and detail exactly why all the sliders are where those sliders are. So going into the league settings, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we are on Heisman. We are playing on fastest coach XP settings, and then we are playing on 7 minutes, Excel clock 19 seconds. We're also playing with wear and tear on, but with a reduced impact. This might be a little bit too much of a reduced impact, so keep that in mind as we go through. But we've taken a lot of these impacts down to 40 or 45 depending on what it is. And so, a lot of the things like normal tackles, catch tackles, cut sticks, things that shouldn't have that big of an impact, we took all the way down to 40. Things that still should have a decent impact but not as much of a wear and tear impact as they did on the base would be things like hit stick. Defender tackle advantage should have a big impact. Impact blocking should have a little bit of a bigger impact than just, regular blocking, regular sacks, regular tackles, and whatnot. So this would be a good opportunity for you guys to get a screenshot, if you would like to, of the basically tackling defensive impact of those things. And then the recovery side of things has things turned up. And again, this might be a little bit too high of recovery. This was kind of just where we have been playing at right now. And we have per play recovery 55, so just turned up a bit. Per timeout 60, between quarter 65, halftime 70, week-to-week recovery 75, and in-game healing reserve pool 65. While we're here, we might as well also mention we are going to 25 max transfers per team, and we are keeping the base 55 and 55 for player transfer chance. Not that that interacts too much with sliders, but we're here, so we might as well mention it. The base number, just so that you're aware, has somewhere in the range of 2,500 to 2,700 players roughly transferring out on a year-to-year basis, which is actually semi-realistic to real life. We actually want a few more transfers in our dynasty, so we're going up to max 25 per team. And so that is everything in a quick roundup. Now let's go ahead and talk about why we have all of the sliders where we have them for Heisman. And yes, I know last year we played on All-American, but them changing the way the game plays a bit this year makes it so that Heisman is actually finally viable. Where last year, and don't get me wrong, this year Heisman is still a cheat code, especially for the CPU, and you'll see some wonky things happening like triple tipped passes that end up with a defensive lineman scooping it up as an interception and running back for a touchdown and crazy stuff like that, as well as linebackers jumping 15 feet in the air to get an interception that they never actually could in real life, but having it so that they can't intercept balls that they're not facing and things like that makes it a lot more viable. Realistically, before I get into these sliders, I do want to make a plea in case anybody over there at the dev team is actually watching this. Please give us a setting to turn off abilities within CFB 26 like we have within Madden, because truly turning off abilities would give us the best gameplay, the most realistic gameplay results, because you wouldn't have a lot of the glitchy things like even though you have run blocking turned up, you get tons of instant sheds off a defensive lineman no matter what, because abilities override sliders all the time. And you wouldn't get things like, even though we have to turn down pass coverage and whatnot and interceptions, you wouldn't get things like defensive linemen getting 3 picks a game because they have an ability that allows them to do something silly. So, you know, having the ability to turn them off would be great, but we're working with what we got, which is improved from CFB 25. So we actually started out testing quarterback accuracy for players all the way down in the low 40s. And we came back around to 55 quarterback accuracy. And you guys might call us a little bit crazy, but the reason for this is because when you have good quarterbacks, they should be able to hit their targets consistently. And on even just 45 quarterback accuracy and even on 50 quarterback accuracy, we were noticing something along the lines of like 50% pass completion for quarterbacks. And I was personally, as well as the others that were testing, seeing a ton of just overthrown balls on various different passing types from revamped to classic. We were just seeing quarterbacks not hitting their targets. And we're talking about 90 plus overall quarterbacks with 90 plus accuracies just not hitting their targets even anywhere close to them. So we moved it up to 55, and we're seeing a lot more consistent completion, a lot more consistency with quarterbacks that are supposed to be able to hit their targets. Now, it might give you a little bit too good of accuracy with lower end quarterbacks, but it is what it is. I mean, we have to try to find some type of realism, and having quarterbacks that are really good having below 50% completion on basic passes is not realistic at all. Then we turn pass blocking up to 65. This has to kind of be here. It's unfortunate. You're still going to see a lot of offensive line goofiness, and that the same thing's going to happen with run blocking. Unfortunately, the blocking in this game is maybe worse than CFB 25. I can't really tell yet, but there have been so many times in both the passing game and the running game where a defensive lineman or a pass rusher just comes completely unblocked. They run straight past the left tackle. The left tackle doesn't even move, and it's because there's wonky things going on, like them locking onto a linebacker that is on a delayed pass rush and things like that. And in the run blocking game, same thing. You get just a lot of free defenders, not even blocked on certain plays. And some of that has to do with the adaptive defensive system, where if you call a play a couple times in a row, they'll adapt, and so it gives them like free block sheds, or it makes it so that your O-line is incompetent and doesn't block. if you call the same play too many times. So there's just some wonkiness going on there. This helps correct for it. You know, we were on 55 and then we moved it to 60 and it just didn't make any difference. And moving up to 65, we might even move this to 70 just to see some amount of difference, to see a little bit more consistency in the blocking game. Moving on from that though, at wide receiver catching, we turn it down to 48. Players just shouldn't be catching every single ball that comes their way. And this has actually been one of the best sliders that we found so far, where you get a couple of contested drops and things like that, but players that are meant to catch the ball are still catching the ball very consistently. And, you know, some of you might say, well, the reason your quarterback accuracy is low for your quarterbacks and they're not hitting their passes is because you have the wide receiver catching down. But trust me, that's not been the issue. Truly, the quarterbacks have just been missing their receivers without the receivers even having a chance to get a hand on the ball. When you pass the receivers the ball, they're still catching it most of the time on the 48 slider. It's just nice to see the occasional drop because it's more realistic to college football. And as I mentioned with the blocking, we now have run blocking up to 57. There's so many abilities on the defensive line that create instant sheds and whatnot. It's just so hard to get a consistent run game going against good teams, good defensive lines in this game. And so this helps to balance it out a little bit. We always turn ball security up a little bit because, you know, we know this is a bit of an arcadey game and they're going to make it so that hit sticks and cut sticks and whatnot and stripping can cause more turnovers than is realistic to real life. And so turning this up a little bit, you still see fumbles and whatnot, but we turn it up just to make it a little bit more realistic. On the defensive side of the ball, it is certainly a little bit more difficult to cover and get interceptions with user AI controlled players, if that makes sense. Your defense is just not going to do quite as well as the CPUs will. So these ratings will be a little bit higher than the CPUs, but the CPUs are all turned way down. So pass defense reaction time down to 45, just to make it so that your defenders aren't breaking perfectly on every single ball. Your interceptions at 35, just to make it a little bit more difficult to get interceptions consistently. Not every interception is a catch, right? I mean, in real life, players drop interceptions or they get tipped off their hands all the time. And then pass coverage at 48 because, and I'll mention this with the CPU sliders, you see a lot of defenders that run routes better than receivers do. And it's really goofy and kind of not fun to play with. So we have to turn it down so that defenders aren't just running the routes in front of the receivers and getting free broken up passes or interceptions simply because they're coded to run the route better than the receiver. And that's the only way that they can code defenders to cover tightly. It's unfortunate, it is what it is, but it's what we have to work with. And then we have tackling up to 55. And this is mainly due to the fact that it gives a wider range for tackles to actually happen. You'll notice on the base that a lot of times you'll be right there in position for a tackle and a guy will just run right by you, even if you're doing the correct things, hitting the correct buttons and whatnot. And so turning this up just makes it so that your players kind of lock on when they're supposed to, when they're in position. That's just kind of another wonky little gameplay thing that really shouldn't be as big of an issue as it is, but we have to adjust for it a little bit. As far as CPU skill is concerned, we turned quarterback accuracy down to 40. We were playing with this on 45 and even into the low 40s, and you would still see low-end quarterbacks with perfect accuracy all the way through a game, which is not realistic. And so we turned it down to 40, and we're finally seeing some quarterbacks missing throws, making some worse decisions, and they're still, don't get me wrong, passing for like 75% completion and whatnot, so you could potentially drop this lower, but it's much more realistic and it makes it competitive. Obviously, the CPU plays quite different than a user would, and so they do have to have a bit of an edge coding-wise in order to be able to keep up. Their pass blocking is down to 45. Again, they get so many advantages, and you oftentimes can't get to a CPU quarterback in time. This makes it so that you can get a little bit more pressure on them and force some more incompletions. Wide receiver catching at 48 for them. I've noticed that it's very consistent between user and CPU players, so 48 is just a really good catching point for both sides. Run blocking is at 47. Their run blocking is just a little bit too consistent as compared to the users, and so we have to turn theirs down a bit. We already mentioned ball security a bit. Again, too easy to force fumbles and whatnot, so we make it a little bit more difficult to do that. And then we have pass defense reaction time down to 45 because they break on the ball way too easily and way too perfectly most of the time. Pass coverage all the way down to 40, and we might even consider dropping this further because even on 40, you're seeing, as an example, let's say a guy runs a slant route or a zig route or something. You see defenders that shouldn't be good coverage players, like, certain linebackers that aren't even good coverage players. They just get out in front of the receiver and run their route for them. And it's just super unrealistic the way that it works. They're not playing actual football technique, and so we don't want to see that in our gameplay. We would much rather see incomplete passes based off of contact and contested catches, right? So the ball gets there, the defender breaks on it and hits the receiver's arms or tackles them and jars the ball loose and whatnot. Not, oh, well, he was running in front of my receiver step for step, and so the ball just never even got to my receiver. That's just not realistic. That's not football technique. So 40 is better. We might test it out even lower than that, though. And then interceptions down to 25. Even on 25, they get a crazy number of interceptions. I mean, I'm talking about like defensive linemen, like nose tackles, getting interceptions all the time in my games and whatnot. And I'm wondering if this needs to go down to like 5 or 10, to be honest with you. And then same thing for them, tackling up to 55, just to make the tackling a little bit more consistent and kind of on par with what the user has going on. As far as the field goal stuff is concerned, we tried field goal accuracy down to 45. It was a little bit too difficult to consistently make makeable field goals. 47, though, is a good spot because you want them to be a little bit more difficult. In college, field goals aren't a given, and so we turn that down a little bit. Punt accuracy, we turn down a little bit. It's pretty easy to get really good punts, and again, it's not as consistent at the college level. Injuries, 35. I think this is down slightly just because we were noticing with our fatigue and the combination of the wear and tear, even though the wear and tear is turned down, we were getting a few too many injuries too consistently. Fatigue up to 70 is roughly where we play all the time, and this is the best spot, really, somewhere in the 65 to 75 range to get players rotating into the game, which is realistic. And we will maybe play with the precipitation stuff later on. We just haven't gotten enough weather games to really tell if this needs to be modified at all. And then, like I said, the penalty stuff hasn't been bad so far, so I don't know that there's too much that we need to do there. The other big thing is the wear and tear stuff, depending on what you're doing with your league. We want to be able to have the wear and tear system on because it is cool and it is more true to real life, but it was too crazy to where players were just not even playing at certain points in the season, not necessarily in parallel to what would actually happen in real life. So, you might want to adjust some of those things as you see fit. But like I said, this has been really good for consistent gameplay. And just to show you some more results on my end with a different team, looking at a better team like LSU, we had a really close game, 27-20 with Clemson. We were able to blow out Louisiana Tech, which is pretty realistic. We had a really close game with Florida, 31-24. A bit of a closer game than you might expect with FCS Southeast, 42-20, and then a 35-27 loss to Ole Miss. So it's been really, really solid for competitive gameplay. And to be honest with you, fairly realistic gameplay. Now, this game against Ole Miss was one of the ones I was talking about where it was just like interception after interception for the CPU, which is a bit annoying. So we're still working on some things. The sliders aren't going to be perfect, but I think this is going to be a really fun set for you guys to play on here early into CFB 26. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, if you enjoyed the discussion aspect of it, or if you just were here for the sliders to be able to play a realistic or fun dynasty within CFB 26. Leave all that feedback down below. Subscribe if you're new around here or have not already. And if I didn't mention it already, please hit that like button. As always, I'll see you in the next video, and I hope you have a good one.